Okay, in this lecture we're going to talk a little bit more about expansion during the Roman Republic. And in particular, I want to talk about three wars. I don't want to get too involved in what's happening in terms of all of these battles. I'm not totally interested in military history, but these wars are important to talk about because what ultimately happens is that Rome really becomes an empire after this, a small empire, but they continue growing for various reasons we will talk about. These are Punic Wars. These were with a city-state, really empire, naval empire, centered in Carthage, North Africa. As you can see here on the slide, it was a colony of the Phoenicians. Phoenicians were sending out colonists starting around 1200 BC, and some settled in Carthage, and then it became its own civilization. The Romans called these the Punic Wars because, as you can see, let me see if I can write on this. You've got the P here, the N, and the C. It ultimately comes down to Punic from the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians were a fairly large empire. They controlled the Mediterranean Sea in terms of naval power. They also controlled a good part of Spain and the island of Sicily. And if you remember a map, I think I've got a map here. If you look here, this is the island of Sicily, and of course, this is North Africa. So the two civilizations, the Romans and the Carthaginians, were actually fairly close. And then in this top section, what I've done is I've shown you where Carthage is. So when we start talking about these battles, you'll know where things were going on. As I mentioned, you've got three wars. The first war, and I've given you the dates here, it wasn't started because of a direct confrontation between the Romans and the Carthaginians. It started when you had a little battle between some people who were living on the island of Sicily, and what they ended up doing is asking for help from both the Carthaginians and the Romans. And when the Romans arrived, the Carthaginians were unhappy that the Romans were there, and this started a battle between the two of them and actually became a war. And you can see from the dates it was a fairly long war. What's interesting about this is that I'd mentioned that the Carthaginians were a naval empire. Rome was not. So at the beginning they had no navy. You know what they're going to do? They're going to end up building a navy. This was a pretty serious war in terms of the amount of people lost. So I've given you some numbers here. When the Romans started building their navy, they weren't exactly navy people, and what they soon realized is that it's very dangerous to be on a ship during a storm, which they hadn't really considered. What they ended up doing, though, and there's some really interesting archaeological remains being discovered on the western tip of Sicily right now, they put these metal tips on the ends of their ships so that what they would end up doing is ramming another ship with this thing called the Raven. Now, ultimately, at the end of the First Punic War, the Romans pretty much won the island. You know, there's some debate over what exactly happened during this period and what exactly was the outcome. But you've got Sicily becoming a Roman province. And as I put here, you've got two of those big islands that are just off the Italian coast, Sardinia and Corsica. They become provinces as well, and they start collecting money. Now, one thing I want you to start thinking about is as the Romans start capturing more and more land, they're capturing the people, they're making these people into Romans, and then they tax these people. So a lot of new wealth is starting to come in, and of course, all of this new land is starting to be controlled by the Romans. You've got these people called praetors, and we haven't really talked about these people. These are really governors. Governors that are sent over. Sometimes, well, in a lot of cases, they are Roman senators who are no longer on the Senate, or they're still in the Senate. They go over, take their spot as a governor, and then make a massive amount of wealth off this. One thing the Romans did, and you probably would have guessed this based on what I talked about before, in terms of when Romans take over land, they make this agreement where you've got people who owe their allegiance to Rome, and Rome will protect them, and those people have to give up men for the military. So what the Romans ended up doing is keeping the local governments in place, unless there was someone giving in trouble, but in general they kept the local government in place, and then that was used by the Romans to also govern. You get the Second Punic War a little bit later than this, and this really is the one that's probably the most famous because you get the Carthaginian general named Hannibal, and he is remembered for a number of different reasons. One is that he ends up taking elephants from Spain into, I mean, they weren't originally from Spain, but they got to Spain, and then he takes them from Spain up through Italy, or up through the Alps, over the Alps, and then into Italy. Now, the Romans had never been fighting with the elephants, and of course, that was a very new thing. This was an interesting war because, as you can see, the Carthaginians took the war under Hannibal to Italy. And you can see what they ended up doing is they never got control, they never took the city of Rome. They would get close. Hannibal had a kind of a hard time in Italy, depending on the people he was fighting with or against, because Romans were held to this oath of loyalty to, or the Italians were held to this oath of loyalty to Rome, and sometimes that would hold, and a lot of times the Latins would realize that they were actually better under the control of the Romans than they would be under the Carthaginians. So anyway, you see this is a major map of this particular area. Now, this war started in Spain, which, if you remember, at this point was controlled by the Carthaginians. And Romans were asked for help, and the Romans arrived. And of course, this time the Carthaginians got tired, and as I just talked about, sent elephants up through the Alps. Some of these battles were pretty serious. It lasted for a pretty long time. You've got Hannibal pillaging, which is essentially grabbing whatever you can in terms of the wealth or the agriculture, and then using it up, thinking that this would weaken the Romans ultimately. You can see the very famous battle called the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC, where the Romans lost quite a few men. This is also the war where the Romans have their first taste of the Greeks, because what the Greeks end up doing under Philip V is joining the side of this war with the Carthaginians and not the Romans. And this is going to have a pretty devastating impact on Greece, as we'll talk about in just a bit. Now, I had already mentioned this too. I probably should have looked at these slides a little closer before I started talking about them, but most of the Italians stayed loyal to the Romans. Now, what the Romans ended up doing, of course, they're fighting with Hannibal on the Italian peninsula, but what they end up doing is sending two people with the last name of Scipio to Spain. And of course, if you think about it, one way to really put the pressure on Hannibal is to send an army to Spain to cut off his supply lines. And so that's exactly what they did. Now, it was a pretty serious fight, and then what ends up happening is probably one of the more famous Scipios, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was also fighting in Spain, but he was sent directly to Carthage to fight against the Carthaginians. Now, of course, Hannibal at this point is still in Italy. So he gets news that the Romans are in Carthage. He packs up, and if you remember the map I just showed you, he sails to Carthage. Now, what ultimately happens is that he loses the battle, and the Carthaginians lose the Second Punic War. Scipio is sometimes referred to as Scipio Africanus, and that's because he sails to Africa and defeats the Carthaginians. Now, what normally happens in these battles is that you normally don't get a total destruction of a civilization. You will get that with the Third Punic War, but not in the second one. Usually terms are agreed to, and the Romans agree they will stay out of certain areas, and the Carthaginians agree to stay out of certain areas, and they promise they'll never break these oaths. And of course, they do. Now, with the end of the Second Punic War, Rome decides to get pretty serious with trying to prevent a further outbreak. So as you can see here, I list a couple of things. The Carthaginians had to destroy their navy. What this ultimately means is that the Romans become the masters of the sea at this point, the Mediterranean Sea. The Carthaginians had to pay a pretty high war penalty or an indemnity. And one thing that really did not make the Carthaginians happy is that they had to discuss raising another army with the Romans before they could actually do it. Now, of course, what this means at the end of this war is that the Romans have not recontrolled Italy, but now Hannibal is not there, so that's really what they're doing. They're mopping up there. They also have Sicily from the First Punic War. They also gained Spain through this Second Punic War. And as I put here, and I mentioned this before, when you gain all these new territories, all this wealth ends up going back to Rome. And as I put here, especially silver goes back. Now, what they ended up doing after defeating the Carthaginians is that, if you remember the map from, I think, last week where I showed you the Celts who were in control of the northern part of Italy, the Romans spend a good part of that period after the Second Punic War fighting against the Celts in the north. And they also start fighting with the Macedonians or the Greeks because of what had happened in the Second Punic War. Okay, Third Punic War. Now you can see I'm going through this quickly because I don't want you to get too bogged down in the details of these things. But you've got the Carthaginians attacking an area in North Africa called Numidia. And as you can see here, they were Roman allies. I think the Romans at this point had really gotten sick of it. Romans sent a pretty big army to Carthage. And I put here the city was destroyed. There's sort of some debate whether the Romans actually totally destroyed a city. Because what happens after this is, of course, they take over North Africa. And you've got all this wealth of North Africa now funneled into Italy. And then they made these territories their provinces. So at the end of the Third Punic War, you've got the Romans controlling Sicily and those two islands. You've got them controlling North Africa. You've got them controlling Spain northward through the Alps and again down into the northern part of the Italian peninsula. And they're starting to push into Greece. And by the end of the Third War, you've got really the destruction of Greece, and that area becomes under Roman rule. So what I've got here is expansion into the east. And there are a couple of really interesting things. Again, I know these are all battles. It's kind of hard not to talk about military history this period. Mostly our sources are coming from Roman historians who, of course, write about great men, great generals, great battles. So we're sort of stuck talking about this for right now. Next week, we'll start talking about Roman women when we have a little more sources for that. But you've got the almost before the First Punic War, some conflicts between the Greeks and the Romans, where we've got a king named Pyrrhus. He invaded the southern part of Italy. He was actually pretty successful with holding back the Roman troops, but it was costly in terms of the number of men. So he held the battlefield, but lost a huge amount of men. And this is where we still use this phrase today, Pyrrhic victory. And as I put here, it's a victory that's so costly, it's actually considered to be a defeat. We've talked about King Philip V. You also have the Romans sort of being invited into another section of the east called Pergamum, and where you've got one of the family members of the generals of Alexander the Great asking for Roman assistance. And so the Romans are aware of this territory out there. They do defeat Macedonia. That becomes a province. And then, as I just mentioned, at the end of the Third Punic War, Greece becomes a province in 146. And you can see from this map, even though a little bit's cut off down at the bottom left, you can see how large Rome actually is now, because what they end up starting to do is push into Persian territory as well. Now, they're not quite in Egypt just yet, but they will be soon. Now, there's a lot of debate in the scholarship about whether Romans are expanding on purpose, or if this is something that seems to be sort of accidental, like the Carthaginians are bothering them. They go to war and they win this large territory. Carthaginians bother them again with Hannibal. They go to war and they're left with Spain and parts of Gaul. And then again, you know, they have to go to Africa and they get North Africa. That, for some scholars, seems to be sort of an accidental growth of their empire. But by about 140 BC, so a few years after they take over Greece and parts of the area you can see on the map, it looks like they really wanted to expand. So again, there's lots of debate about this, and maybe we can talk about this in a few weeks when we come back to this.